Lisa Banczak, and welcome to episode 71 of Books Cubed, the show where I chat with authors you should be reading. It is Thursday, July 23rd, 2020, and today I've got a real treat for you. I am chatting with a professional bookbinder, Lisa Pelt. She is fascinating, and it is so interesting to hear how she puts books together. But before I get to that, if you're on video, I'm halfway done with my hair. It's very pink. But I'm running out of time to get this done because it takes about 3 hours for the color to set on my hair to really make it bright. So I had to jump in here and do this real quick. Anyway, if you're not on video, you don't care. Let's see. Before we get to the interview with Lisa, if you can read cursive handwriting, the Library of Congress has a really interesting project going on right now where they're having people transcribe cursive writing, and it's fascinating. If you can read cursive, you'll want to try this. You go to crowd, crowd.loc.gov, and just scroll about this far down, and you will see all the information about the project. I tried it myself, and yes, I can read cursive writing. I could not read the document that they had showing. If you have a lot of patience and you love history, I love history. I don't have a lot of patience though, so it's not a good fit for me, but it might be for you. And thanks to Mary Mayweather for telling me about this. We've had her on the show before. She's a romance writer. It's a fascinating project. It's to let people be able to search documents and find information without having to read this cursive writing. And it's a skill that's being lost because they're not teaching in schools anymore, I don't think. So if you can do it, go over and volunteer. I think you'll have a lot of fun with it. Let's get right to today's interview with Lisa Van Pelt, and I will see you after. I'm going to welcome Lisa Van Pelt. Did I say that right?
Yes, that's it.
Fantastic. And you are a bookbinder, which I find very fascinating because I am obsessed with books. When I was little, my dad had all these books, had a library, and we had a complete set of, I want to say it was Balzac.
Oh, yeah.
My mom ended up, they were like really old, and my mom gave them to some library, which just destroyed me because I wanted them because they were beautiful. But I have a whole set of stories that were like Robinson Crusoe and Swiss Family Robinson and all these stories that are leather bound. And when you open the page, when you open the book, it's got those beautiful papers inside the leather cover. And then there's hand drawings. And then there's a little piece of tissue paper on top of the drawing that you can lift up to look at the drawing. I was going to look for it, and we have so many boxes packed. I thought, well, I'm never going to find it. But so I was fascinated to hear that you're a bookbinder. So when people think of books, they go to the store and they get a mass market paperback off the shelf, and it's glued, and it's paper, and it comes apart if you bend the spine too much. So that's much different than what you do.
Right.
So just walk people through what the basics of a bookbinder are, the basics.
So, the mass market paperbacks with all the glued spines that don't last forever, they definitely serve the purpose of getting books to people cheaply, which is great. But the things that hand bookbinders do are, we're focused on creating an object that is a book. It's a work of art. It has art inside it. It's made as if it's a work of art. So usually I do edition binding. So that means I do multiples of, anywhere from 20 or 10 to 50 in an edition. And I work with artists and printers or sometimes just rare book dealers and publishers. And they put together the guts, the innards of the book, and they send that to me, and I go through the process of designing the binding with them. If they have ideas, of course I'm gonna use those. And, but usually what I'm doing is trying to design a binding with the structure and materials that kind of augments or communicates some of what's going on inside the book. So, so the pages come to me and they've got the, works of art, the either lithographs or monotypes or hand drawings sometimes, like you were talking about. And they come with the text. And so the first thing after design is, really folding the text, sewing all of those sheets of paper together by hand with thread and needle. And it's then taking that block of text and creating a cover around it. Sometimes the text is sort of integral to the cover, and so it's a folded kind of origami thing. It depends on how modern or classical the book wants to be. So then there's sometimes making those handmade end papers like you were talking about, either doing some marbling or paste papers or collecting those from shops elsewhere, and doing the stamping. Sometimes they're leather covers, sometimes paper, sometimes metal, sometimes other random things that the client wants. But it's all, each detail takes its own amount of time. Like those leather covers, the leather will be bought in a lot and they'll be prepped to some extent before they get to me, but then you're taking paring knives and thinning out the edges of the leather so that when you fold it over onto the board of the cover, you get a very tight, thin, very tidy look to it, instead of lumpy. And we're not exactly trying to take all of the naturalness out of the material, but there is some sort of marriage between the natural material and craftsmanship that we're putting together in these pieces. So, and then there's stamping at the title page and not the title page, but the cover, labeling, all that, using foils and hot stampers. And that's sort of, sometimes there's also boxes included where all of these things get to put into archival boxes that are, elaborate or very simple. But that's sort of the rough overview of what goes on in making these books.
Now, when you put it together, when the pages come to you, are they all separate, or are they
Yes.
already? So they'll just give you a stack, and then you've got to figure out the best way to make those stay together.
Well, sometimes they give you, they already know the collation, and so they've printed it in a way that when you fold two pieces together, they'll actually be page 1, 2, 3, 4 when you fold them. Otherwise, sometimes they'll say, I've got these stack of pages and this is the order they're supposed to go in, and could you figure out how to make that work? And can be more or less of a challenge. It's much easier if they've figured out the collation and you could just fold the pages together. But yeah.
So what are the different ways? The books I buy at the grocery store, they're glued. And I remember being at a new house. We had no furniture yet. It was super cold. We had a fire going, and I was reading Hawaii by James Michener. And every time I turned a page, it came out of the book.
Right. Yeah. They call them fastback books, basically, because they're so fast to put together. And it's kind of like, you have a pad of paper. If you haven't moved all totally to Post-it notes, you have a pad of paper with that kind of gluey bit at the top holding it all together. That's basically what that kind of binding is. Just a big glob of glue to hold single sheets together. And single sheets are always a challenge anyway, but if you're going to put it together with glue, it's just inevitable that it'll fall apart. It's great because you can read something on the cheap, but It's not gonna be a family heirloom in that particular state for very long.
No. So what ways do you put them together then? Because I know that you can hand sew them. I've seen that being
Right,
done. And
right.
just for someone who's never seen it or heard about it, what's involved with hand sewing a book together?
So when you can take a page that's, you know, of any size, and you fold it in half, you get basically four sides of a page. So four, and it's this little folio, what they call a folio, and it's got the gutter where the pages come together at the fold. And that you fold all these pages and you put all the gutters of those pages, line them up. And so they're a stack of folded pages. And then you just take linen thread of various sizes, thicknesses, and a binder's needle. And unless you can either sew them directly to each other through the gutter, through the fold, and down into the next page, and through the fold, and out, in and out, and in and out. And you can either do that with or without. They have what they call binding tapes, and so they're tapes that run the width of the book spine. And so you're sewing all of these different folios together onto these tapes or cords. And in that case, when you see those old leather books and they've got these raised bumps on the spine, up and down, those are usually, unless they're fake, they're usually, or they're fakes of, or there really are cords, like hemp cord, little, hemp cord that those signatures, the folios, they've all been stitched onto those cords, and those cords are really the strength of holding those pages together. And so when you're opening and closing and opening and closing those books, those pages are not going to fall out. They're not going to separate because those very strong cords are holding them together. They have synthetic, binding tapes that sort of mimic that same process but aren't as bulky and are used a lot too. But those old bindings stay together so well often because they're made with pretty strong materials, and the linen thread, as long as there isn't anything on them that a bug wants to eat, they stay pretty well intact over centuries.
Yeah, and is that the paper? I mean, thinking about you're sewing, and that makes a little hole in the paper.
Yeah.
When you're sewing, is the quality of the paper, the construction of the paper itself, is it a tighter weave? I don't know if you want to call it a weave. Is it just a tighter, so that when you sew through it in those early couple hundred years ago or whatever, and that's why the books have held together better, is because it's a better quality, better made paper than what you might maybe find today?
Well, definitely rag paper, like things made out of cotton rags, when that kind of paper sort of became what, the transition from parchment, which was basically goat skin or other kinds of skin, made really thin, which holds up a long time, but gets brittle over time. Rag paper was really made out of old cotton rags blended together, and that became a much more sturdy, malleable, flexible kind of material to make books out of. And the paper that are in a trade paperback, obviously those are man-made papers. I mean, they're all man-made. So handmade versus machine-made, I should say.
Yeah.
So the machine-made papers are the ones that will have totally uniform. They're often don't have a lot of tensile strength so that you can rip them fairly easy. They don't have a lot of noticeable grain. There's usually a grain to handmade paper, although that's not always the case. And the grain often gives it more strength. And so because there are fibers that are sort of shifted in the paper making process to go in a certain direction, and sometimes they're laid lines, like the lines that you'll see in a page if you hold it up to the light, that's an indication. Well, that means it has laid lines, and it was just a certain type of paper making process that results in that. But those older papers were acid free. That's a big part in what makes them durable over time. Anything that has a more acidity to it will break down over time. So the machine-made papers are often used with solvents and chemicals that are more acidic. They leave residue on the page, and so over time they're going to yellow more. They're going to become more brittle just because of that. They'll also discolor the materials that they're next to, like the end pages or a box that they're in or something like that. So the acid free is probably the biggest thing to think of when you're wanting paper that will last. It just so happened that that's kind of how they made it way back then, luckily.
Yeah, luckily, because we've got all these great books.
Right.
I know you've talked before about going into collections and being, you put the white gloves on and you get to look at these
Right.
books, which is just wonderful. So some of the books that you make, do they end up in these kind of collections? Because it sounds like these are really specialized and you do very small
Right.
runs. So you have books that are out there that are in collections?
Yeah. I mean, in the sense that, so the people I make them for, they sell these limited edition books, art books, to institutions like libraries, museums, or rare book collectors. And so that's how they make their way into like the Getty or the Library of Congress or the Whitney, wherever they're going. So I don't actually, as a bookbinder, so we're a class of artists that are we're the supporting cast, as it were. Some bookbinders make their own work. And so when you're doing your own printing, your own content, then you're the main characters in the cast list. But otherwise, as a bookbinder and a printer, you are supporting cast. So I don't keep a list of what collections they're in. I just hear from people, oh, so-and-so bought this, book, or, a copy is here or there, and which is always fun. But it's more anecdotal.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, do you find that you yourself are a collector? I mean, do you go to rare bookshops? Do you peruse old bookshops looking for, the antique books, I guess you'd call them?
I love going into those shops and looking and going through them. I rarely buy them, and that may just be because I don't have a lot of disposable income. The books I've collected are either a copy of the books that I've created, or there have been some more affordable new editions that I buy at places like Codex Book Fair. It's a big event in the Bay Area that happens every other year, where new work is presented, and there's all kinds of everything from zines to these $25,000 photography art books and things, but that are all handmade, and they're all this sort of fine binding, often, except for the zine side of things. Anyway, so there's a lot more variety and fun things that you can pick up, and so I tend to collect those types of things, this sort of a little more ephemeral stuff.
Yeah. So thinking unusual. So what would you say was the most unusual book that you've put together? Most unusual materials, maybe, because you said before that there's all kinds of things from leather to wood, I think you said, and then there was something else.
Right.
But what is something that people would go, oh my God, you made a book out of that.
Right. Yeah, I wish I had something that was totally weird. The things that I make myself for like little craft or, bookbinding projects that are just for myself, I'll try and use like sticks and twigs and all kinds of random things. But when you're making an edition and you have to make 25 books the same, there is a limiting factor in needing materials that will do the same thing each time, or you can find 25 of them, or whatever. So probably the most the out of bounds thing that I used was metal, very thin bronze, like it wasn't copper, but a very thin metal that I patinaed and made all kinds of weird like swirls on, and then pounded into place and cut myself millions of times and made them into covers for this one edition that we did.
What do you
But
pound
then
the
you'll
metal?
have other things. What?
What do you pound the metal into to make it stay?
Well, you're really trying. What I did was basically try to treat it like any other kind of material, which, is not. I could have come up with a lot of different things if I hadn't done that. But what the client wanted was me to use it just like you would use paper. It was thin as paper, like a thick cardstock. And so I folded it over, the board and glued it down and, sandwiched all the edges so that nobody handling the book later would actually cut themselves the way I was doing it. And if you ever took these books apart, you'd probably notice a few little blood spots inside the book, but otherwise you wouldn't see them. But once it was all sort of sandwiched together and all the edges were hidden, then it was a safe book to handle.
Yeah. Oh, that is really, really interesting, thinking about all the work that would have to go in. Yeah, you think a little bit of you goes with every one of those metal books.
Right. A little bit. Yeah. Yeah. When I used to work for other people, we would, when I was younger, in my 20s, and we were kind of like studio hands, um, we were making, this huge, we were working on these huge projects because we worked for some pretty amazing bookbinders. And every once in a while, we would slip in a message into the spine just for future conservators to find.
Oh, that's really cool. Yeah. What kind of things would you write?
Well, some of it came about just because we would be using scraps of paper, and you hear this all the time about people restoring old books and they're finding like waste sheets inside, the spine that were like old pieces of like really famous books that got cut up because they were damaged and they just got used for linings or whatever. And so some of that would be, we'd be cutting up these strips of, things that we had written notes on. And, so you'd get these weird cryptic notes from, 1999, in these things. So it wasn't any, I don't know if I should confess to anything.
Oh, probably not. Probably not. We don't want to get you in trouble. So if you have a really old book, there's chances are there might be something interesting inside the binding.
But don't take it apart, because that you would ruin the value of the book. So
yeah, that's true. So
just imagine that it's there.
So if you have a book that is an old book, like I talked about the series of books that I've got somewhere in one of the many boxes that I have not unpacked ever. Sometimes the leather is torn in the back.
Yeah.
So is that something that is easy to fix, or do you have to completely, what do you have to, what would you do? Would you be able to do a repair to a book, to a leather book that had tears in it? Would somebody be able to come to you about that?
It's possible to make those kind of repairs. I usually only know enough about repair and conservation to fix my own mistakes. So like blood spot, I know how to figure that out. But if it's pretty much any part of an old book, you can absolutely come up with some way to fix it. It's this sort of debate between, do you alter the original enough to make it super functional in the current day, or do you try to preserve the original as much as possible, even if that means that part of it is falling apart? You know, like some really old books you don't want to try, or manuscripts you don't want to do anything to. You just want to house them in a way that'll halt the deterioration. But if it's like 100-year-old book or 50-year-old book that you just don't want it to fall apart anymore, and you want to make sure the cover stays on, then you can absolutely take a cover off. You can patch areas so that it looks very subtle, like a very subtle patch. Usually a conservator or restoration person will try and preserve as much as possible of what exists, and just sort of in the background, sort of subtly make it so the hinge actually works again, or something like that. So
Yeah, well, I suppose if it was a book that was loved and passed down and you wanted to share it with your family, you know, you might consider, or a family Bible or something like that.
Right, exactly.
To have it repaired so it would be around for, you know, future generations.
Right, because once there's a tear or a something falling apart in the book, it sort of exponentially, you know, deteriorates, in my experience. Once the cover is hanging off by, you know, a little bit, and it's not so long before it's hanging off by a thread. So
yeah.
Don't use tape. Whatever you do, don't use tape, because
No.
speaking of acid, using tape on paper will hasten the deterioration of the paper. So either do some Googling to find a better solution, or talk to a professional.
Okay, people, if you have a book with issues, don't try to fix it yourself.
Don't. Well, YouTube might help a lot. So not discounting that, but beware of tape.
Yeah. So you what was your training? I mean, were you a little kid and thought, I want to make my own books? I mean, how did you come about with a career of bookbinding?
Right. I know it's weird, a little obscure. I did make books for myself and for my friends when I was in high school and when I was in college. And I studied architecture in college. So it was, you know, designing and making things on a big scale. Not that we did that as students, but, you know, that was the idea. And then it was right after college that I was working in an art store, like you do, and I got hooked up with a bookbinder who was looking for other people to work in her studio on this big project, and that was sort of the beginning of the end. I mean, that sounds really bad. Anyway, that was the beginning where, I mean, I had taken a couple bookbinding courses just for fun, and then I started working for this person. And because I wasn't a total disaster with the glue brush, she kept me on, and I worked for her and a couple other bookbinders for 5 or 6 years, and eventually started just working for myself. So that's how it happened.
Nice. So you didn't really fall into it, but the opportunity presented itself and you took advantage of it.
Right. Yeah. It kind of worked out that way.
Nice. Now you talk about presses, and I know there's machinery involved. When I think bookbinding, I think everything by hand, but everything isn't done by hand, is it?
Right. So there are specific tools, you know, everything, you know, you got your hand tools. Yes, you got that. But then there's everything from the non-mechanized machinery type that I would use would be a big, what they call a board shears. It's a cutter that can cut large pieces of paper, very straight, everything precise. squared, all that. You know, mine's a 45-inch bed and has 100-pound counterweight on the blade. And there's a lot of, you know, it's from the late 1800s, so it's got a lot of old time allure. And then there's there's standing presses, book presses. There's everything from a nipping press, which is small, and you've probably seen these in old bookshops where they've got a little, you know, a screw on top, a wheel on top with a screw that goes down and nips together these cast iron plates. And then I have a 7-foot standing press, which was meant for the kind of work that I do, because in edition binding, you sometimes want to have 25 books or more in the press between metal edged boards, squishing everything together, accentuating the groove and all of that sort of stuff. And so all of that stuff is non-mechanized. But then there's things like hot stamping machines where you're using gold foil or any other kind of foil. People use hot glue, so that's a little acidic, so you got to be careful where you use that. But so there are definitely, you know, there are bookbinders who use things like a Smythe sewing machine, which is a not by hand machine, but it reduces the cost of making these kind of books by a considerable amount. So some bookbinders with big shops will do sort of multiple different kinds of bindings. You know, they'll do all by hand, or they'll do a combination where it makes something more accessible.
Do you have a favorite way to put a book together?
I particularly like non-adhesive bindings. So I had one client in particular who also likes non-adhesive bindings. So that's a joy, because she's always looking for something that's light and airy, and you know, she's making text out of so the words are actually watermarks, so you really see them when you hold them up to the light, and you see, you know, kind of like a watermark in a handmade paper, that you can see the stamp of the handmade, you know, the paper maker in it. She's got the text going through these white sheets of paper that you can read in that way. And so I created a binding where everything else was sort of in this light, translucent, movable, airy kind of construction that didn't use any glue, just used tabs, and did use, you know, linen thread and things like that to hold it all in place. But other than that, there was a lot more movement, and it was much more delicate, to be sure, than anything that you're going to glue together and be able to put in one of those nipping presses. But it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun to make, and it's a lot of fun to handle. So those.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. And the thing about books is you want to handle them, you want to touch them, you want to turn the pages, you want to smell the leather or feel the cool touch of the metal.
Right.
with the non-sharp edges.
Right.
And, yeah, and you want to experience the book. A book is an experience.
Right.
It truly is. And yes, there's all kinds. There's ebooks, and there's, you know, that's one kind. But and I read ebooks, and I'm sure you do too.
Yeah,
and,
convenient.
You know, yeah, I mean, you know, but I prefer. I like the hardback older books. I like when they have that leather backing, and it just, and you know, the raised lettering, and sometimes there's a little,
you can feel it as you touch it. Yes.
The feel and the smell, and then the pages, and then you turn them, and you don't have to worry about them ripping. The older books, and like you were talking about before, it's a sturdier. What'd you call it? Rag linen?
Well, like the rag paper,
Rag
sturdier paper. It's not all made out of rag, but still, it's any kind of linen or rag paper is very nicely. You can, I mean, Abaca. I mean, you could get all kinds of fibers. Abaca makes a beautiful, but a little more brittle paper. So you know, it's you can have so many. There's so many varieties of what you can make the paper out of, what you can choose for materials, that it's kind of this wonderland to play in for me as a bookbinder. That's one of the things I like about it most, is just working with all these different materials and trying to figure out how I can use it to create an experience of looking through this book that sort of is synergistic in a way. So it's, you know, all the parts are adding up to more than the whole. So it's a fun process.
Yeah, yeah, definitely experience. You're right. It's an experience when you hold these books that are like you
Right.
talked about with the watermark, the text as a watermark. That would just be fascinating to
Right.
just to hold that and look at that book and experience that. Now now you're not just a bookbinder, but you're also a writer.
I do dabble in that. Yes.
Yes, and you have a. Do you want to talk about that? Yeah, I know you're working on a project right now that kind of mirrors a little bit of what you do for a living.
Right. So, you know, during COVID times, I put the work you're referring to on hold because I couldn't get my mind around it for some reason. But that one that you're referring to is the main character is Bookbinder. And so there's a lot of references about the studio and what's in the studio and the type of materials, and working with a collector client to rehabilitate or just box old amazing collections. And so that and you know, the things that you can find, the sort of mysteries that you unearth in that process is sort of what that story is about. So I hope to get back to that eventually. But right now it's one of the novels under the bed, you know, type things.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's definitely. Would it be a mystery then?
It's a bit of, yes, it's a mystery. So in the sense that this bookbinder has a mysterious illness that nobody, it's kind of weird. I couldn't write about illness while we were going through COVID-19, I guess.
Yeah.
So the bookbinder has a mysterious illness that none of the doctors can figure out, you know, and she's starting to think she's crazy. And then she's looking through this book that that is owned by the collector she works for. And it has a description of her symptoms right there. And it's a 500-year-old book. And how could this person writing this manuscript have known what her symptoms were 500 years before? And so she goes on a hunt of trying to figure out what this person is writing about, and sneaking the book out of, you know, or photos of the book out of the collection so she can research it more, and trying to solve her own mystery by trying to figure out what this book was about. So that's the mystery.
Oh, that sounds really good. So you need to get back to working on that.
Yeah, yeah.
Most definitely. So if people are interested in finding out more about bookbinding and what you do, how can they find you?
Well, they can go to, the easiest way to go find me is to look for my website, which you can get to by typing in lisavanpelt.com. That sends you to my website, even though it's called lvpbookbinding.com. It's, you know, they both go to the same place. And that has links to both, you know, the types of books. You know, there's all kinds of photos in there of books that I've done, which I need to update with some of that recent stuff. And, you know, some social media sites that I have an Instagram account that I put studio pictures into when I'm working on a project. And so you can find lots of informal pictures about, you know, the process. And so lots of sewing pictures. So that's a good place to see, like, if you want to visualize what this sewing thing is, lots of that. And also I love to show people the new bookbinding books that I find or have in my studio, because I think if somebody really enjoys thinking about bookbinding, they might want to try to do it themselves. So it's not a bad idea. Anyway, you can find all that on my website.
Oh, fantastic. So everybody listening, you can just drop down to the show notes and you can find all the information about finding out more about Lisa and her work. And when I'm done with this, I'm going to run to Instagram and take a look at all your pictures because I find it fascinating, absolutely fascinating. I wish that there was no COVID and I could come and see your studio.
Right.
Would have been nice to interview you in your studio, um, just to
Right.
see.
This isn't exactly what my studio looks like back here, as you can tell. Right now I'm in my messy office, so I can't even turn that screen off and have you look at the studio.
Yeah, yeah.
But
If you're listening on the podcast, we both have virtual screens behind us
right.
because yeah, same here. My office is a wreck, absolute
Yeah.
wreck. So absolutely scary. And I love my office because I have this gorgeous little red refrigerator in the corner.
Nice. Good.
Oh, I love it. Usually it looks great. I got my little I don't know, various things that well, actually all the stuff is off my walls because we thought we were going to have to move and then we didn't. But anyway, so yeah, I know. Right as COVID was starting, our landlord said, "Oh, I'm kicking you out so I can sell the house." And we're like,
What?
"The state's in a lockdown and we can't go anywhere." Yeah.
No, it's terrible. I'm so glad that didn't happen.
Us too. You know, I found one moving company that was actually taking supplies to stores, helping to bring like supplies to Walmarts and things like that. And so they said, well, we can send a truck up, and they had all these procedures for making sure, you know, nobody got sick and all that.
Right.
So I felt really safe, you know, chatting with them. And it would have been to another house in the same town somewhere, but it was like,
But
dude, what are you
now's a
thinking?
bad time for this. Yeah, well, he probably figured out pretty quickly that it was not a good time to sell a house either. So
No, you know, yeah, you go to Zillow and it says there's no walking through houses right now. You know, you
right,
can look at
right,
pictures, but no one is going to walk you through right now. So yeah, he
right.
figured out pretty quickly that it wasn't a good idea. No, no.
Phew.
Yeah, yeah,
Well,
that was crazy. That was crazy. But thank you so much for coming on today. It's just so fascinating. I mean, I could listen to you talk about. I mean, we didn't even talk about end papers and things, and those are the
right,
things that you put inside the inside cover.
right, right inside the cover. And then you can have a fly leaf, you know, even sometimes even a couple pages of decorative sheets at the beginning and the end of a book, depending on, you know, how old the book is, or just what they feel like putting in there as decorative bits.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. I was thinking when I was thinking about talking to you, I was thinking I would love to create some sort of a book, have something put together where I could have it hand done and have it just like you were talking about, where it was something that I just don't know what though. I mean, I don't write poetry. I write right now. I write cozy mysteries, and I'm getting ready to start a sci-fi series.
Cool.
Yeah, so I thought, well, I don't know, maybe I don't know. I'd have to think about it, but I think it would be really, really cool to have something that was maybe even, you know, my cozy series has it's the girl that she doesn't want to be a detective, and she ends up having to always seem to be, she's kind of finds herself always in the middle of things, but she has this greyhound. It's actually not her greyhound, it's her friend's greyhound, but the dog's always with her, it seems. And it would be fun to have the dog etched, you know, into the
Oh
cover
yeah, absolutely.
and do
You
like
could
a,
do that pretty easily. I mean, you get a die made with the image on it out of a certain metal, and you put it in the hot stamping machine, and you just print it on the cover. Not hard, not hard.
that would be really cool to do some
Yeah.
limited editions, maybe to raise money for greyhounds. I'm always trying to think of ways,
Oh
because
yeah.
I used to have a greyhound, and when I used to do video work, and I did some stuff for the greyhound people now to try to help them out. But that would be
Fascinating.
fun to maybe think about doing something, doing
Yeah.
a limited edition of maybe what's a good size? I mean, how many pages when you're talking limited editions? How many pages is too many? I mean, what's a good
Right.
size?
Yeah, they're much smaller, much thinner books than like your normal novel, for instance. Like I've never actually, well, I've at another binder's studio, I've helped to bind a novel, but it's usually the stuff I end up doing aren't that long. They're, you know, under, geez, how many pages? I get this question and I'm like, really? I wonder how many pages that all is. I mean, because it could be anything from, you know, something like 50 pages or 30 pages, or maybe up to, nothing more than 100 pages kind of thing. So that's partly because these structures, well, really, the heavier the book, the more robust that structure and binding has to be to hold it all together. So like you have these big old tomes, from monasteries that are rather large, both in thickness and in height and width and all that. And those are sewn on cords to keep it all together, usually leather bound, something very strong. The leather they use is, not going to use, just going to use very strong materials. The old parchments, those definitely start to fray at the joints and things like that over time because of the weight of the book in part. So what I end up working on are much lighter books, and that opens up the field of materials a little bit more. But if you want to use, you can definitely, do a novel in this way, but that's sort of the type of thing. When I mentioned earlier, there's binders that have bigger shops and they've got Smythe sewn books, or the machine that does Smythe sewn, which is, it's everything but hand sewn. It's using the needle and thread, but it takes a larger book block and keeps it sort of under control while you're trying to do all that sewing, and the machine takes care of that part. So those are steps you can do to make it a little more accessible. And they do all the kinds of, end papers and stamping on the covers and all that stuff too.
I'll have to see if I can come up with maybe a short story.
Yeah.
That would be.
Well, you could do one of the novels too. I'm just saying,
Yeah. That might be fun
it
to
presents
think about.
other kinds of limitations. The bigger it gets, it's not at all impossible. It's just sends you get this category of options as opposed to this category of options.
Yeah. Well, it's all very exciting to think about. I'll have to think about that. But so people can find you. Ages ago, you said it was lisavanpelt.com.
That's right.
That's right. And you're on Instagram. So check out the links in the show notes, and you can find all of her information and all kinds of great photos about bookbinding. So thank you so much for coming on today.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Lisa. You can go down to the show notes and you can click on the links and you can see her Instagram and Pinterest pages. And I highly recommend you go and check them out. She does gorgeous work. And that's it for this time. If you have any comments, click on that comment link and it will take you to our YouTube channel and I will read them and respond. It's just too hard for me to look around all the places that the show airs and I'm lazy. So if you could just go to that link if you want to comment. If you have a book you want to recommend, or if you've written a book that I need to read, please let me know. I'm desperate to read more good books. And I'm also on Instagram, Books Cubed. Really easy to find. So that's it for this time. And have a wonderful day and go out and go read a good book. And I'll see you next time.